Welcome back to the Law&Crime Network. I'm your host, Carissa Kranz, and with me is Aaron Keller, co-host here on the Law&Crime Network, and we are covering a really special segment today. The Supreme Court announced today that it's not going to weigh in on the famous Making a Murder Netflix series trial and rehearing the case of Brendan Dassey and whether or not his interrogation was coerced or whether or not it was voluntary.
Yeah, that's the big issue, Carissa. Okay, so we're going to take this away here. Little did I know more than 10 years ago when I was covering this case as a local reporter in Wisconsin that we'd be sitting here talking about whether or not the U.S. Supreme Court was going to pick the matter up. Well, earlier today, the U.S. Supreme Court denied the petition for certiorari. That's the request Brendan Dassey filed asking that court to review his case. Now, the upshot of it is ultimately that Brendan Dassey will remain incarcerated. He'll remain in prison. Reaction has been blowing up on Twitter about this, and to discuss the case is Jerry Buting, who many of you know from Making a Murderer. He was Stephen Avery's attorney during Avery's trial. Of course, Avery, the uncle of Brendan Dassey, whose appeal was rejected today. Jerry, it's good to see you again. It's been a long time.
Good to be here.
Yeah, so what's your initial reaction to this, Jerry? I mean, it's not a surprise statistically that the Supreme Court wouldn't take this case, but it's a big letdown for a lot of people who felt justice just wasn't done here.
It is. It's very disappointing to a lot of people, and not just Brendan Dassey supporters, but advocates for juvenile justice and fairness in police encounters with juveniles. There was a lot of hope that the Supreme Court might take this case and finally reinvigorate what they said 40 years ago, that juveniles are different, that what might not overcome the will of an adult certainly could when it comes to police interrogation of juveniles. So the hope was that the Supreme Court would reinvigorate that, because the lower courts in this country really have ignored it for many years now.
Yeah, and I think that Brendan Dassey's legal team, which had some heavy hitters on it, really made that point clear in the briefs submitted to the court. But the court didn't pick up on it, despite the argument being well made that, hey, look, as you said, Jerry, it's been 40 years since we've gotten into this area of law, and perhaps it's time, to use your word, to reinvigorate it. But look, we didn't even get a dissent that the case wasn't picked up. There could have been a dissent filed if one justice felt that the court should have picked this case up, but we didn't even get that here.
No, we didn't, although that's not unusual. Oftentimes they just simply deny a writ of certiorari without comment. That's the vast majority of cases, in fact. That's what they did here. The record was massive in this case. It was only submitted to them after the final briefs just about a month ago. There were videos of the interrogation that were included. I got to wonder how thorough a review they really were able to do, because this is the end of their term. And if you look at all the number of cases they actually considered at conference last week, it's amazing, as they're trying to get decisions out in new cases and also deciding certiorari. So I wonder how carefully it was reviewed, but nonetheless, it's disappointing. The other problem that Brendan had in his case is that it was there on habeas review, which has a whole additional set of obstacles and standards that have to be met before they agree to even accept cases, much less allow a federal court to reverse a state court decision.
Exactly. I mean, habeas corpus review is statutory. It's mentioned in the negative in the U.S. Constitution. It just says, well, if it's going to be taken away, then it can be done, but it has to be done a certain way. The Constitution doesn't guarantee the right. That's something that comes from Congress. And Congress, when it passed this Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, made it really hard for people to seek habeas corpus review, because the standard is really deferential to the trial court and the state courts. In other words, the federal courts have to really kind of let the state courts do their thing and can't peek too far into the reasoning. They just have to determine whether or not it was reasonable. But Jerry, I keep going back to the state court opinion here, the State Court of Appeals opinion there in Wisconsin where you sit. There was not a lot of discussion about whether or not the juvenile confession of Brendan Dassey was coerced under the language that juvenile confessions are supposed to be getting special look, special attention, special care and consideration. They really blew through that issue very, very quickly.
They did. The whole decision, with the massive volume of documents and video recordings in the case, the Court of Appeals in Wisconsin's entire decision, I think, was 11 pages. They used maybe a half a page talking about the, Brendan Dassey's characteristics of being a juvenile and with special ed classes, mental challenges. So they really did not analyze it at all. They simply parroted a couple of words from other cases, and that was one of the arguments that Brendan's lawyers made, is that they didn't really carefully apply clearly established Supreme Court law anyway in this case. But, the Supreme Court has passed on an opportunity, I think, to really help to restore people's faith in justice, after making a murder and because of many, many other cases of wrongful conviction. More and more you hear people losing faith in the fact that, in the hope that our American justice system can provide real justice and truth. And I think this would have been a good opportunity for them to do that. They can speak with authority. They chose not to. Nevertheless, there are things that people can do if they really want to try and fight for other people, because there are thousands of Brendan Dasseys in this country, if not hundreds of thousands. The DNA exoneration cases, when they go back and study them, they found that 43% of the times when juveniles were falsely convicted, they had falsely confessed. And that's when DNA proves they had nothing to do with the crime. Nonetheless, 43% of those juveniles falsely confessed. Why? Because of the techniques that the police use and the special vulnerabilities that juveniles have to suggestibility and these police techniques. There are things that citizens can do if they demand better. They can demand the legislatures enact laws to prohibit these kinds of techniques and particularly prohibit them against juveniles, which is what the state of California and Illinois have already done.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. You've got these legislative enactments that can protect individuals in situations like this. But Jerry, I want to take a quick pause here. For those of you who never did watch the interrogation of Brendan Dassey, it's lengthy. Carissa, I know perhaps you didn't get a chance to watch it. I want to play a couple of clips from it here briefly, and we'll come back and discuss those ideas in just a bit.
Honesty here, Brendan, is the thing that's going to help you. Okay, no matter what you did, we can work through that. Okay, we can't make any promises, but we'll stand behind you no matter what you did. Okay.
And what's he doing?
He's working on his Monday.
What about the fire?
Do you mean if it was started or something? No, it wasn't.
Okay. We're not going to go any further in this because we need to get the truth out now. We know the fire was going. We know that he had already had his altercation with Teresa. We don't believe there's a Monty in there. I talked to you the other night, and you said nothing about Monty. You said nothing about something getting punctured and leaking out. We talked about cleaning something up in that garage. You told me that you thought, thinking back now, that it was blood. It was red in color. 6:30. I'll go that far with you. It might even been earlier. What's going on? Let's take it through honestly now.
Come on, Brendan, be honest. I told you before, that's the only thing that's going to help you here. We already know what happened. Now, let's be honest. What did he tell you? What did he show you?
What did you see and what did he tell you?
He showed me the knife and rope.
Where was she? Come on, we know this already.
In the back of the Jeep.
She was in the back of the Jeep. Was she alive or dead at that time?
Dead.
There's some of the critical pieces of the confession of Brendan Dassey. Was it a true confession or was it coerced? Jerry Buting, who was attorney co-counsel to Brendan Dassey's uncle, who also faced charges in this case, is here with us on the Law&Crime Network. Jerry, a lot of people, when they watch that, they feel very sorry for Brendan Dassey. They think he was being pushed around. They think he had nothing to do with it. They think he just went along and agreed with interrogators because he thought that they were there to help him. And, you know, look, I really struggle with this, and I still struggle with it to this day, because it's possible that that's what was going on. There's another way to look at the interrogation, though, as well, and the jury looked at it and gave it a lot of credit during Brendan Dassey's trial. After that interrogation played, a lot of members of the jury just didn't even want to look at the defendant. So which side of this is really the true side? Is it a good confession or is it a false confession?
Well, see, you know, when people rely on the fact that, oh, well, Brendan's jury convicted him and they heard this confession, that they take some comfort in that, but they should not, because in fact, people who watched Making a Murderer saw more of the interrogation session than Brendan's own jury. The prosecutor objected and successfully kept from his jury all of the interrogations that took place the day before and the day before that, in which all of these promises were made to him, in which they said, you can make it look however you want. Yeah, we're police officers, but not right now. I'm like a father who wants to go to hug you and, you know, let you get out whatever you need to say, because we know it's not your fault. It's the uncle's fault, Stephen Avery's fault, and he made you do this. You can make it look however you want. We'll go to bat for you. We won't leave you high and dry, and on and on and on and on like that. Those kinds of assurances and implied promises of leniency were never shown to his jury. And in fact, you don't even see those in Making a Murderer. Nobody in the public saw those until I filed the entire set of interrogations recordings publicly after Brendan's trial, after Stephen's trial, when we were preparing for Stephen Avery's sentencing, because I knew that Stephen's judge had never seen any of the interrogations. The state didn't use Brendan Dassey in Stephen's trial, and I knew that it would give a completely different perspective on what really happened if our judge knew it and if the public finally knew it.
Look, I agree with that, Jerry, and I remember being there when you handed over the stack of transcripts and the pile of compact discs, and you know, it was only at that point that those of us who were watching the cases were able to see this. We had been sold a confession quite some time before by the special prosecutor, and it was delivered to me before I think you were even on the case as being ironclad. This is a confession. We know definitively what happened, and that's the way the special prosecutor tried to sell this to the public, including me, and I was sitting right in the front row in front of him in one of the now infamous press conferences that he gave. It wasn't until you put the whole thing on the record that people started to look at this and say, gee, this might not be as ironclad as it was sold to us originally.
That's right. And, you know, when at that press conference, when a few people were skeptical and said, yeah, you know, all this cutting and stabbing and throat slitting and, you know, was there any DNA at the scene that corroborates the kid's story? Somebody asked, one of the reporters. And at that point, Kratz, the special prosecutor, gets coy and says, we're not going to talk about that kind of information. In fact, there was no corroborating physical evidence that supported any of that statement. And we found later, when we got the discovery, that the prosecution knew that crime lab tests had already been done, that disproved most of the story that they were putting out into the public as supposedly the truth.
Jerry, I want to play one more quick clip of the Brendan Dassey confession recording. I want to come back and ask you about a tweet that you sent out this morning that was a passage from your book. We'll do that in just a second.
Let's be honest here, Brendan. If you helped him, it's okay, because he was telling you to do it. You didn't do it on your own.
Think about it and be honest.
So just be honest. We already know.
He's obviously not holding anything back from you. He had you come over to see this.
So the question that the U.S. Supreme Court has decided not to take up and answer is whether or not words like that overbore the will of Brendan Dassey, who had some intellectual challenges and who was basically being asked to confess to murder. Jerry Buting was co-counsel to that young man's uncle, who was also charged in the case, of course famous for Making a Murderer. Jerry, you tweeted out a passage from your book this morning in reaction to the U.S. Supreme Court not taking up this case. I want to give you a chance to talk about that very quickly, because I think that it's a passage that resonates.
Yeah, well, my book is entitled Illusion of Justice, Inside Making a Murder in America's Broken System. And the reason I came up with that title is this case is a perfect example. As if now that because the Supreme Court has not heard this case, somehow justice has been served, when really all that's been presented is this illusion of justice in America. And, you know, that's got to stop. It's hard not to despair when you see what happened in this case. Anybody who watches these interrogations, any ordinary person who watches these interrogations can't help but feel bad for Brendan and think, this guy got screwed. How is it that our justice system can allow this to happen? America, which is supposed to be that shining city on a hill, offered for the rest of the world to emulate. How can this happen? Well, unfortunately, it happens a lot. It happens way too often, and Brendan's experience is very common when it comes to juvenile confessions. You know, it's easy to despair and lose faith and hope in our justice system, but you know, despair only leads to failure, whereas hope leads to the truth. And that's where I want us to go. I want us to look forward. You know, luckily, Brendan's options are not foreclosed. There are some other options, whether it's newly discovered evidence or Brady violations that may have occurred in his case. And he has two excellent attorneys in the Northwestern Center for Wrongful Conviction of Youth that are going to continue to represent him. But there's thousands of other juveniles out there who need help. And I think that people shouldn't give up. We just need to be motivated even more so now to fight for justice in this country, to see that things change. It's time to get rid of the bad prosecutors and sheriffs and judges that people have a right to elect and unelect. It's time to change some of our laws to limit the sort of police coercive techniques that are used in this case against vulnerable juveniles. There are many things that we can do. I talk about them further in my book, and I hope that if anything, this, rather than losing faith and despairing, that instead people take this as a motivating incident to force us to really make criminal justice reform a priority.
I'm out there lecturing about many of the issues in this case. I know you are too, Jerry. So, whoops, sorry about that.
Okay.
I guess that means time's up. We're going to move along and take a quick break. But Jerry Buting, author of Illusion of Justice, the star of Making a Murderer, always appreciate chatting with you. I'm glad that after all these years, we still can converse about this. It was a difficult case for both of us.